All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely deconstruct what is honestly a deeply meta and just absurdly over-engineered literary artifact, one that is simultaneously hilarious but also emotionally devastating. Today, we're looking at an analysis, a brutal, funny, yet surprisingly poignant critique of a collaborative piece called the Plath-Akutagawa Triptych. We're going to explore exactly how two writers built this elaborate, impossibly complex structure for the sole purpose of holding an imaginary conversation between two iconic historical figures. Now, this quote right here, it perfectly captures the absolutely savage critique leveled at this triptych. The source material describes the work as architectural fan fiction for the afterlife. I mean, it's a fictional dialogue constructed with so much pretension it practically requires a union card. Essentially, we've got two deceased literary giants, Sylvia Plath and Ryūnosuke Akutagawa, meeting in this metaphysical space to trade trauma, like, as one critic hilariously put it, Pokemon cards. It's dense, it's heavily annotated, and it is deeply, deeply self-aware. Section 1. The Impossible Museum. Building an ontological waiting room. So, to set up this meeting, the authors faced a literally impossible problem. How on earth do two dead writers who never met, spoke totally different languages, and died 36 years apart actually sit down and have a conversation? Well, they solved this by inventing an infinite metaphysical museum. But they didn't just place the characters there. Oh no, they padded the entrance with a massive 600-word prelude. It reads like a terms and conditions agreement for a fictional space. It establishes the all suicides table, gives hyper-specific instructions to the witnesses, and literally pauses to check in and see if the reader is emotionally ready before the play even starts. Section 2. Sylvia's Infinite Cigarettes. The ashtray as a secondary character. Let's look at how Plath actually enters this space. She walks into the Impossible Museum, completely skips all the pleasantries, doesn't even bother saying hello, and just launches right into a 700-line correction of her own famous bell jar metaphor. And this brilliantly illustrates that goth teenager's Tumblr archive vibe the critics called out. During this intense monologue, Sylvia is just constantly lighting cigarettes. By a generous estimate, she smokes something like 47 imaginary cigarettes, turning the ashtray on the table into a literal black hole, making it a significant secondary character that just sits there witnessing the whole shebang. Then, from across the table, Akutagawa finally interrupts her. But, he doesn't ask how she's feeling. Instead, he looks at her and asks with complete, deadpan seriousness, "The jar is made of what?" He delivers this hyper-literal philosophy of mind question, essentially peer-reviewing her metaphor's structural engineering in real time. He wants the exact material composition of the metaphor that is not a metaphor. And the amazing thing is, instead of just rolling her eyes at him, Sylvia takes this metaphor more seriously than any metaphor has ever been taken in the history of literature. She answers him by hyperfixating on the exact refraction quality of her depression's container walls. She details the age of the glass, the thickness, the little bubbles in it. As the critics note, this is either a perfect moment of literary precision, or it's just two writers in the middle of the night getting entirely lost in their own metaphor. Let's be real, it's definitely both. Section 3. Akutagawa's Cold Tea. Formal Restraint in Grief's Waiting Room. Meanwhile, Ryūnosuke Akutagawa is essentially playing the role of a 19th century diplomat tasked with facilitating a very difficult HR conversation. When things get heavy, his gesture of grief stops exactly 3 inches short of physical contact. It is the ultimate formal physical restraint. But he essentially operates like an NPC in a broken video game. Notice this endless defense mechanism tea ritual he executes. He pours the tea, waits for the absolute perfect temperature, leaves it to go cold, and then drinks it cold. This loop repeats and the tea remains cold for 40 pages of dialogue. But look, putting all the roasting aside for a second, we really have to admit this setup is smooth as hell. It brilliantly contrasts the two absolute poles of human psychological suffering. On one side, you have Plath's crushing claustrophobic immediacy, being entirely trapped by proximity under the glass. And on the other, you have Akutagawa's vast, boundless, directionless dread, being entirely lost in infinity. The natural, almost musical cadence between these two opposing forces is a stroke of absolute structural genius. It perfectly captures how we all process pain differently. We're either crushed by it immediately, or we get totally lost in its vastness. Section 4. The Meta Apparatus. Footnoting the Void.
Now, the creators just couldn't resist getting high on their own supply of metafictional concepts here. They are constantly dismantling the fourth wall to analyze their own ethical hazards. For instance, they introduced the phrase bonyari shita fuan. Because they are constitutionally incapable of not explaining things, they deliberately translate this term into English, spend 4 sentences explaining exactly why the translation is insufficient, and then undermine it immediately. They literally do a translation just to perform the failure of language using language. And of course, an over-engineered artifact of this magnitude needs appendices, right? 4 of them, in fact. The creators didn't just break the fourth wall, they brought in a seminar table and forced the audience to sit down and read a thesis on whether the play you just read is actually good for your neurochemistry. It is a complete, total over-contextualization of the art they just created. Section 5. The sound of silence, the most pretentious flex. Let's look at the grand finale. This brings us to the third panel of the triptych, which, was implicitly promised in the title itself. We're told in the text that this panel is entirely comprised of white space and absence, the thing that cannot be said. Now, you might expect actual quiet here, but no way. The authors assigned this silence a job. They gave it performance metrics, titled it, gave it a Roman numeral, and actually annotated it in the appendices. As the critics savagely, and I mean savagely, pointed out, this isn't actual silence. You can't just leave it alone. It's performance silence, doing a TED Talk about how profound it is. They literally footnoted the void because they were completely unable to let the silence just be silent. Section 6. Why it actually works. Over-engineered right to the edge. But here is the massive plot twist of this whole critique. Okay, yes, it's literary grief cosplay. It is insufferably self-serious. There's even a 3 a.m. collaboration note between the writers left directly in the final manuscript. But here's the unvarnished truth the critics finally admit. It actually works. It works completely. They over-engineer this entire museum right up to the very edge, and then Sylvia drops this one devastating sentence. Any version of me, however broken, would have been better than my absence. That one line just cracks the whole pretentious structure wide open, leaving absolutely no apparatus between you and raw, genuine grief. The room goes quiet, and it just hits you. So the final verdict from the critics comes in at a 9.2 out of 10 on the hauntingly beautiful but please touch grass scale. The piece takes 2 highly mythologized suicides, turns their pain into an incredibly pretentious aesthetic object that is so refined it could literally cut glass, and yet, somehow, through all the cold tea and infinite cigarettes, it delivers a deeply moving masterpiece. Which really leaves us with a lingering, fascinating question. In our desperate attempts to over-explain and structure our pain with infinite museums, appendices, and hyper-analyzed metaphors, do we accidentally build the very cathedrals that help us survive it? Perhaps the extreme meta-commentary and structural obsession wasn't just literary flair at all, but the only human way to safely hold something that is otherwise far too painful to be held. Think about that the next time you find yourself over-analyzing a tough situation. Until next time, keep exploring.